Okay, so welcome everybody. This is the LUNN seminar. I'm very pleased to welcome Sara Farris. I thought that Sara Farris, the name was English, actually it's not. We just discovered we are both Italian, so it's such a pleasure. Anyhow, Sara is a professor of social theory at University of Bologna. Just recently joined the very prestigious alma mater of Bologna, the oldest university in the world. So congratulations. And then he was also a reader in sociology at Goldsmiths, University of London. And she's the very well-known author of the book In the Names of Women's Rights, The Rise of Femonationalism, which was published by Duke University in 2017. And that's the reason why she's here. She's going to basically have a sort of retrospective look at the book, what originated the book, reflect on the legacy and possibly the way forward. Sara has also published extensively on gender, care economies, social reproduction, nationalism, and migration. So I already see that everybody has closed the camera, and I guess everybody is already muted. That's great. So I'm also closing the camera, and then Sara is going to speak for about 30, 40 minutes, and then will be Q&A at the end. So Sara, the platform is for you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Marco. Yeah, first of all, I really want to thank you for this invitation. It's a pleasure for me to be speaking in this context. I know you have a very well-established seminar on nationalism, and because of that, I really hope we can have a discussion on this concept, nationalism, and what it means today, particularly in the context of the rise of the far right. So what I thought I would do today, as you mentioned, really is to, first of all, present the main ideas, the core arguments in this book on femonationalism, In the Name of Women's Rights, The Rise of Femonationalism, and move on to then trying to understand and analyze what are the contemporary facets of femonationalism. So what we can already see are the new directions undertaken by this phenomenon. Let me share my slides with you. One second. Okay. I hope you can all see my slides. Please just let me know if that's not the case. So I will begin, as Mark also said, by speaking a little bit about what prompted research on this book. I am a scholar of gender, migration, and care economies. And so this is really has been my main work over the years. And at the beginning of the 2010, as I had a fellowship as I had fellowships, in fact, more than one, across several European countries, I was increasingly struck by the ways in which in these different countries, as I was traveling through Germany, the Netherlands, where I spent a few years, but also the United States, I was struck increasingly by the ways in which not only the far right parties were rising, become increasingly prominent in public politics, but particularly the ways in which they were using in almost paradoxical ways feminist ideas of women's rights and gender equality in their campaigns. As somebody, as I said, who had worked on migrant women in particular, gender and migration and care economies, I was especially struck by the ways in which migrant women, particularly Muslim women, were represented within these rhetorics by the far right. So whenever they were talking about or mobilizing feminist ideas and women's issues, they would be representing migrant and particularly Muslim women as victims of male violence, victims of misogyny, fundamentally claiming that misogyny was particularly strong in some cultures and some non-Western cultures rather than Western cultures, and so on and so forth. So this was, in a way, the first thing that prompted me to ask, what is happening? What is really going on? This book started within this landscape, but clearly is building upon and drawing upon research that started in the late 2000s on these same issues. So my research was influenced conceptually, at least partly, by the concept of homonationalism introduced by Jasbir Puar to try and understand what she called increasingly the entanglements between sections of the gay community in the United States, of the LGBT movements and American nationalism, particularly in the context of the war on terror in the 2000s. Many of you might remember that. But I was also in dialogue with the work of French scholars, for example, such as Éric Fassin, that worked on sexual nationalism, again, trying to understand why the far right was increasingly mobilizing issues of gender and sexuality within their campaigns, or the work of Lise Fekete, who here in the United Kingdom also talked about, along the lines of sexual nationalism, she talked about enlightened fundamentalism. So this was the context. I want to give you some I will give you some examples, but first I want to tell you a little bit about the reception of this work. So the book was published in 2017, and in a way I was partly surprised by the way in which it was internationally received. There have been several translations into several languages very recently, into Farsi. Obviously, on the one hand, I've been flattered, as any academic who writes a book and not only discovers that somebody has bothered to read it, but also that people and scholars in other parts of the world are reading it and willing to translate it. But at the same time, it became very apparent to me that the reason for this international reception is the fact that this is a phenomenon on the rise, that the increasingly far-right parties across different countries, not only in Europe, are using the language of women's rights, are mobilizing the feminist lexicon in order to put forward their hateful anti-immigration and racist campaigns. So alongside, if you like, the rewarding experience of seeing your work and your concept being used in many different contexts, there is also clearly a certain unease and concern about the reasons behind these spread, which is precisely an increasing rise alongside femonationalism, obviously of the far right, and its politics of hate and racism in the name of women's rights. I want to give you some examples of how these politicians and these parties use this language of women's rights. This is really probably one of the first but clearest examples, and it's also one of those that really sparked my curiosity into this phenomenon. This is from, I hope you can see the whole slide. This is from what was called the Lega Nord, now Lega, which is a far-right party in Italy. This is from 2005, 2006. It was the time when there were discussions at the level of the European Union on whether admitting Turkey into the European Union. And this was the response of the Lega Nord. Absolutely not. Are you willing to take the risk not to the entrance of Turkey into Europe? What was the risk? The risk, as this image, I think, captures really well, according to this party, was to have European women that you can see in the image on the right are represented as free, professional women, having their freedoms, instead being turned into women behind cages, as according to them happens to Muslim women in a country like Turkey. the years after, there are really so many examples. I just chose a few just to give you a sense of how many far-right parties across Europe are increasingly using this language. This is in an interview from Rocío Monasterio, who is one of the leaders in the Madrid region of Vox, one of the rising far-right parties in Spain. She is an architect. She's one of the leaders of Vox, as I said. And in an interview, she claimed that the only time that she felt discriminated as a woman was then she had to tell Muslims, Muslim workers what to do. So as an architect, she said, I often, the people I work with are men, and it is only in the case of Muslim men that I found that they were somehow resentful of me being in charge, being the boss, clearly stating or intimating that Muslim men do not respect women, do not want them to be in charge. And there are many interviews and statements of this type. This is a famous now statement by Marine Le Pen, now president of Rassemblement National. This was in 2016. It was when she was still the leader of the Front National. And in a long article, more or less in the same paragraph, as she says, as she endorses Simone de Beauvoir as a French symbol of women's freedom and liberty, she also claims, I fear that the migration crisis, the migrants crisis, signals the beginning of the end of women's rights, which was Marine Le Pen of saying, in a context of increasing migration. You might remember that 2016 was the years of the Syrian crisis, a lot of asylum seekers coming to Europe. She used the tragedy of these people trying to reach safer places to claim that it was a problem that all these men, particularly speaking about men, were coming to Europe. It was a problem, it was a sexual threat for women. We might remember that Marine Le Pen also made this statement just after the facts of Cologne. Again, I don't know how many of you might remember, this was really a pivotal and very central moment in German recent history. Exactly when Angela Merkel was inaugurating her so-called Willkommen politics, namely saying that asylum seekers from Syria were welcome, and in fact Germany had to welcome these migrants. It was also the time when there were some cases of sexual harassment against women in Cologne. There were accusations that it was special asylum seekers that were the ones molesting women, and on the basis of that, which, as you can imagine, was amplified enormously, stratospherically, in fact, on German media, that is also the year in which we see the rise of the AfD, very much playing on the moral panic and the idea that these majority Muslim asylum seekers were a sexual threat. They were a problem for women in Europe. So what is femonationalism? This is the definition that I give in my book. Short for feminist and democratic nationalism, it refers both to the exploitation of feminist themes by nationalists and neoliberals in anti-Islam and anti-immigration campaigns, and to the participation of certain feminists and femocrats in the stigmatization of Muslim men under the banner of gender equality. Femonationalism thus describes, on the one hand, the attempts of Western European right-wing parties and neoliberals to advance xenophobic and racist politics through the touting of gender equality, while on the other hand, it captures the involvement of various well-known and quite visible feminists and femocrats in the current framing of Islam as a quintessentially misogynistic religion and culture. The slides that I've shown you until now have shown only one facet of femonationalism, which is the mobilization by these nationalist far-right parties of feminist themes. But there are two other faces, if you like, to femonationalism, which is on the one hand the involvement of some prominent feminists particularly in anti-Islam campaigns, and I'm not talking only about right-wing women, but also women close to left-wing parties, have increasingly over the 2000s in particular endorsed policies, for example, to ban the veil, the hijab worn by Muslim women in public spaces, or fundamentally endorse the idea that Islam is a particular misogynistic religion, and therefore, and that Western cultures are superior in terms of gender relations to non-Western cultures. And the other phase is the one of neoliberals, particularly through the new immigration and integration policies, and in particular after the global financial crisis of 2007, 2011, neoliberal policymakers at the European level have also increasingly endorsed ideas of Islamic or Muslim backwardness, particularly vis-à-vis gender equality, and therefore put forward policies that, according to them, aim to integrate and emancipate Muslim and migrant women. Because of these facets of femonationalism, I talk of femonationalism in my work as an ideological formation that can be described as a convergence. A little bit of background here. I talk of convergence here between, as I said, right-wing nationalists, some feminists and femocrats, and the neoliberal policies and policymakers on immigration and integration, because I was, at least when I was writing this work, but I will say a little bit about how I would probably reformulate some of these things. But when I was doing my research, some of the scholars that I mentioned, including Jasbir Puar, Fekete, Eric Fessen, were describing particularly what Puar, for instance, called the collusion between American nationalism and the LGBT community as, in fact, a complicity. Other scholars were talking about instrumentalization, so how right-wing nationalists were increasingly instrumentalizing, hypocritically instrumentalizing feminist ideas. Now, while in many ways and in some specific cases, all of this holds true, I think that if you like, the best way to capture what was happening, especially in the cases that I was analyzing, is the term of convergence. And this is because I increasingly see the space that has been created, a space around anti-Islam and opposition to Islam in particular, as a space around which these very different political forces are in fact converging, rather than one being instrumentalized by the other, or one being in a way just colluding complicitly with the other. And I like to also talk about convergence because I think convergence enables us to see the different, but also, if you like, complementary interests that these different actors are pursuing in their mobilization of women's rights. And there are very different interests. And in the book, I also analyze the ways in which they also, in a way, the mobilization of women's rights in this context, anti-immigration and anti-Islam context, is actually serving well these interests or not. Now, one of the key contributions that I intended to be one key contribution of this work is really the idea that if we want to understand why femonationalism has become such an important ideological formation, we need to adopt a political economic lens. This is not to say that other lenses are not important. In fact, I devote one of my chapters to understanding the colonial legacies behind the mobilization of women's rights in these xenophobic and racist contexts. I mobilize post-colonial feminism, as well as theories of nationalism, which, as I write in the book, are much, in my view, much more important and central to understand femonationalism than theories of populism. And these, I would be happy to discuss maybe these more in depth with you later in the Q&A. But as I said, for me, it's really important to understand and to have a political economic lens in the understanding of this phenomenon. Now, in order to put forward a political economic reading, this work really was driven by two key questions. First of all, how is that Muslim women are being presented with offers of emancipation and even rescue in a context of rising Islamophobia and anti-immigration sentiments, particularly regarding employment and welfare? As I said already, in the context of integration policies, which is one part of the documents that I analyzed in my work, it was very clear that one of the reasons why migrant women were increasingly invited to integrate, particularly integrate at the economic level, was to say you need to work because this is also a way for you to emancipate, to really achieve the levels of independence and economic autonomy that Western European women have. And so the key question for me really was, why are they so concerned about the emancipation and of Muslim women? Why do they want to rescue them and save them? The narrative of rescuing and salvation of Muslim women was extremely strong throughout these years. And again, this is something on which I have written a lot in the book and on which I'm very happy to address your questions. And also, importantly, the second questions, are Muslim and immigrant women more generally perceived and represented as an economic threat like men are? This is also was also an absolute key question for my work. As I said, analyzing the rhetorics, the narratives of the far right, not only the ways in which they mobilized women's ideas and feminism, but more generally the ways in which they represented migrants and migration as a threat, it became increasingly clear that whenever they talked about migration as an economic threat, they were always referring to men. There was never really the idea migrant women are an economic threat. Migrant women are taking our jobs. The idea was constantly, it is migrant men that are taking our jobs. Think of the examples, even in this country, if you look back at the campaign by UKIP before Brexit, or the various campaigns by Farage throughout the 2000s, it becomes very clear that the target of their politics is migrant men. Whenever they represent migrants as an economic threat, as those stealing jobs from UK nationals or lowering their wages, you always see representations of either white British men being reduced to begging on the streets. There is a very famous poster showing that, or you can see another very famous poster is the one in which they say we are invaded by these by all these migrants coming to the country. You can see this huge queue of men, in fact, which is, according to UKIP, representing the whole of migrants. So it became really clear that the economic threat is a threat by men, by migrant men, according to these parties. How do we make of this? What do we make of this? And how does answering these questions help us produce a political economic reading of this phenomenon? In order to try answer this question, what I did in my research was I looked specifically at the integration programs and projects that were funded by the European Union between 2007 and 2013. I chose specifically this time frame because in 2007, the European Union introduced a new integration fund, which was meant precisely to fund organizations and projects across Europe that were meant to help migrants to be particularly economically integrated, but also culturally integrated. And so more specifically, I looked into the projects addressed at migrant women. As I mentioned already, in those years in particular, at the European level, there was increasingly the idea that, okay, migrant women are not, they have higher rates of unemployment than men. So what's going on? How is that these women don't work as much as migrant men? So we need to address this. And in order to do that, they reserved a pot of money specifically in order to fund projects addressing the problem of economic integration of migrant women. So what I did, I looked at all those projects that were funded, specifically addressing the integration of migrant women. And I should have said at the beginning, my work specifically focused on 3 countries, France, Italy, and the Netherlands. And so I looked at all the projects funded in that time frame in these 3 countries. And what I found was was a regularity, really. Across these 3 countries, in spite of the differences between these 3 countries in terms of migration histories, nationalities, represented different percentages of women present in migration, and so on and so forth, I observed that the majority of projects that were trying to address the lack of economic integration of migrant women were doing mainly one thing, namely inviting these women to work in the care economies, to work in the care and domestic sector. This is, just to give you an example, the page from Promo Femme, which is a women's organization based in Bordeaux, but there are also other branches across France. And this is one of the organizations that received funding from the European Commission, specifically trying to address the problem of unemployment of migrant and Muslim women, specifically in the area of Bordeaux. And what they did was trying to help migrant women to find jobs as cleaners, domestic workers, care workers, particularly for elderly people. This is an example from Nosotras, and specifically this is an organization based in Florence. It was founded many years ago by migrant women as well as some Italian women. And this organization really has always carried out initiatives in order to help the integration of migrant women. They were also the receivers of funding from the European Commission. And in this report that they produced, in which they explain how they use the funding, again, it became very clear, as this is one of the workers from the organization, they said most of the times what they did was helping migrant women do their job interview. And in almost all cases, these job interviews, as she says, were for care and domestic work. Now, you might, at least I did, wonder, okay, we can see that these women's organizations are, and certainly neoliberal policymakers at European level are trying to channel these these migrant and Muslim women into the care sectors and into the care economies. But what does the far right think about it? How do they address these attempts? Interestingly, Roberto Maroni, who was in 2009 the Ministry of the Interior in Italy in one of the Berlusconi governments, it was the years 2009, remember, was really in the midst of the global financial crisis. It was the high time at which politicians in Europe were rallying against migration, saying migrants are stealing jobs, we cannot have any more migrants anymore because we are in the midst of a financial crisis, so we need to look after our national workers first. And in that context, actually, in Italy, there was a big regularization of undocumented migrants. And in that context, Maroni said, we cannot regularize those who entered illegally. those who rape a woman or rob a villa, and you might notice already the way in which they are clearly gendering their representation of migrants as criminals and rapists. But certainly we will take into account all those situations that have a strong social impact, as in the case of migrant caregivers. So again, even in the context, even by the far right, you could see very clearly, okay, we don't really want migrants because migrant men, they are an economic threat alongside being a sexual threat, but we can close an eye towards women because they are not a sexual threat for sure, but certainly they are also not an economic threat. And the reason they are not an economic threat is because they are absolutely crucial in order for our care economies and our welfare states to keep going, particularly in a neoliberal context of withdrawal of the state from funding welfare services. So to give you my answer to the questions that I set a few slides ago, when I tried to say there is a double standard that's been applied to migrant men on the one hand and to migrant women on the other hand, my take to give an answer is that the double standard that is applied to Muslim and non-Western migrant women in the public imaginary as individuals in need of special attention and even rescue operates as an ideological tool that is strictly connected to the role of these women, present or future, so also potential, in the reproduction of the material conditions of social reproduction. Femonationalism, therefore, in my view, should be understood as part and parcel of the specifically neoliberal reorganization of welfare, labor, and state immigration policies that have occurred in the context of the global financial crisis and more generally the Western crisis of social reproduction. Now, what happens after 2017? This is how I really closed my book, trying to really focus our attention on the political economic aspects. I'm going towards my conclusion. I would be really curious, and I'm very interested also to hearing your thoughts and your questions. Across Europe since 2017, and particularly since the pandemic, we have seen an intensification of femonationalism. As I said, those translations are speaking about an attempt, in my view, by scholars and activists in other countries at understanding what's happening. How is that these parties are increasingly using feminist ideas, but also how is that these parties are increasingly led by women, and how is that we see increasingly also some feminists being in some ways entering these far right spaces, at least ideologically or rhetorically. There is an intensification of femonationalism, as I said, and we have, I think, seen this quite clearly in Italy. I will give you an example. Giorgia Meloni, during her presidential campaign, for the campaign for general elections in 2022, very clearly used a femonationalist repertoire in her campaign. Le Pen, Bardella, Zemmour in France, they have all used, again, this femonationalist rhetoric, very much talking about how Muslims, but more generally migrants, are a threat against women and against gender equality, against women's rights. And interestingly, France is also one of the countries in which we see another phenomenon which is really spreading very fast, and I will talk a little bit about that, which is the rise of women's collectives, young women's collectives, very often like Nemesis, which I name in this slide, which are campaigning in the name of women's safety from a very far right perspective, and constantly telling us women are in danger because there are too many migrants in our countries, and these migrants are fundamentally rapists. They are a threat, a sexual threat against women. In Spain, you have, as I said, the rise of Vox very much campaigning in the name of of women's safety and women's rights against immigration again. And the list could really go on. There are so many examples now all across Europe of far-right parties that are rising in using this femonationalist repertoire. This, for example, was in Italy became a kind of scandal just before her election as a prime minister of the country. Giorgia Meloni posted a very disturbing video in which she showed a case of an act of sexual violence by a, as she writes, richiedente asilo, asylum seeker against a Ukrainian woman. And she claims, I want to hug these women. We cannot anymore accept this happening in our cities. We need to make our cities safe again. This, during the last presidential elections in France, Bardella also addressed women. He devoted a whole 10 minutes video only for women, Son appel aux femmes de France, as it's entitled, in which it's all about, again, migrants, Arabs are a problem. The cities, French cities are not safe because of them. This is a example of Nemesis, the collective of young women that I was mentioning. And as they write in their banners, free us from immigration, foreign rapists out. This is an example from Spain, in which, in this case, the leader of the Partido Popular mentions that Muslims are a problem for Spanish culture and for women, homosexuals, and the possibility for people to feel at home, to feel safe. So again, this idea of safety, women's safety in particular, being in danger. Now, it seems to me that very clearly gender equality has become a very key battleground for the right that allows the convergence between different actors, but also different concerns and themes, as well as very contradictory politics, because you have on the one hand these parties campaigning allegedly or seemingly in the name of gender equality and women's safety and women's rights, while at the same time, simultaneously, they are campaigning against gender ideology, homosexuality, gender courses and gender classes in schools, etc. We have seen more and more how, for example, the idea of Muslims as a sexual threat is being even used by Israel in its genocidal campaign. It's increasingly used, the idea of women's safety is increasingly used in the current obsession with transgender rights. So you might have noticed that the current transphobia and the attacks against trans women in particular is very much played out in the name of women's safety, portraying these trans women as a danger for other women, in particular in public spaces. So all in all, I really just want to conclude by saying I think it's really important to attend and to analyze these contemporary iterations, not just of femonationalism, but really of the ways in which the far right is increasingly addressing gender, is increasingly using gender as a site of struggle. And I will just refer very quickly that this is also the theme of a current Horizon project in which I am involved, which is You There. It's a project that is focusing specifically and explicitly on the ways in which the far right youth, so particularly the youth organizations of far right parties, but also youth new leaders such as influencers, are increasingly mobilizing gender, but also the role that gender plays in their political socialization and mobilization. We have just started in early 2025, and we are already seeing very important findings from our initial analysis and data collection. So I hope I will be able to also perhaps present some more findings when we finish this project in early 2028. Thank you very much for your attention, and I will now stop sharing these slides.
Many thanks, Sarah. Great. Very clear presentation, very informative, and congratulations on the Horizon grant.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
very much looking forward to see what might emerge from there. And yeah, possibly see you again here in the near future. So it's time for comments, time for questions. I do have a question myself, but first, Yuval.
Thank you so much for this, Sarah. This was fascinating and very, very useful. I have a couple of questions. First of all, I really like the kind of the matrix that you build about kind of salvaging and saving Muslim women when they as immigrants and differentiating them from Muslim men. But especially if you're thinking about the far right and the kind of natalist movement that you have within the far right, then Muslim women are a problem because they produce brown babies, right? So I'm wondering how that factors into what you're describing, or in that regard, how is that kind of thought about in these kind of far right movements? And the second question, because you present this very compelling comparative case for Spain, Italy, and France, but I think France is particularly interesting because of its colonialist past, especially in North Africa, in predominantly Muslim countries like Algeria, Tunisia, and so on. So I'm wondering how that colonial legacy kind of factors into what you found.
Thank you, Yuval. Sorry, I see there is. Do you want to maybe take another one and then we see Simone? Sorry, Sarah, do you want to reply right away? You're happy to take a second one?
Actually, if that's okay, I was thinking maybe we can collect a few,
Yeah,
and
okay. Yeah.
so then so other people can also speak.
Yeah, I do understand. Perfect. Yeah, Simone.
Hello, hi Sara. Thank you very much
Hi.
for your talk. My question is about potentially the mainstreaming of femonationalism, and I'm thinking about scholarship, about the mainstreaming of far-right ideas and common sense. Do you see a similar process happening with femonationalism?
Can I see whether there is a third question? And if not, Sarah might answer this too. Sarah, do you want to go ahead and answer this too, and then we see? Thank you.
Yes. So yeah, first, really thank you. These are very important questions. So the first one on how Muslim women were, on the one hand, portrayed as people to be saved, but on the other hand, also as, in a way, being dangerous as producing brown babies. I have to say, really, this is what I stress very often. The far-right rhetorics and narratives on gender, on women, are extremely ambivalent and contradictory. They are really not, if we try to find, like rational linear reasoning within these parties, I think we will have a very hard time, precisely because they adopt different strategies, and they have increasingly done so over the last years in order to really to put forward increasingly their ideas, to become stronger on the public arena, etc. So on the one hand, for example, you could see that they, on a way, jump upon what is the current obsession and trend. In some ways, some scholars, for example, claim that the current obsession with trans women and transphobia, in a way, plays out well in a context like the United Kingdom in particular, because this did not originate with the far right. It was here. They understood it was a good way to create moral panic. And so it's very convenient for them to increasingly mobilize what they call anti-gender ideology at this level. So this is to say they really play and move where it is convenient to them. Now, concerning your question specifically, the answer in a way is complex, because the idea of Europeans saving brown women from brown men, it's not new at all. And in fact, this links very much to your second question about the colonial legacies. A whole chapter in my book is precisely about that. And that's also why I said I don't want to reduce everything to the political economy in a kind of economistic reductionist way. Here, we see a certain modularity of femonationalism, in my view, just somehow in the ways in which Benedict Anderson talked about the modularity of nationalism, namely that you see a kind of repertoire being played out in many different contexts, even though they all claim unicity and uniqueness and singularity. So I think you kind of see a similar pattern with femonationalism, because we can see many themes from colonial times being mobilized. The idea of white men saving brown women from brown men was already there in the colonies, and somehow this is being used again. And there are several reasons for this. Women within the colonial nationalist framework are not perceived as an enemy. They're not perceived as agent, in fact, as having agency. And in that sense, one of the attempts of colonialism, also historically, was precisely that of somehow molding women, the idea that they could take the women from these from the colonies and in fact turn them into their women. And but it was the men that were really portrayed as a danger, also at a biologically reproductive level. In fact, even if you look at the citizenship laws, you can see in several countries that men could marry and give their surname and their citizenship to women from other countries, particularly from non-European countries, but not the same was possible for women. So women in the Netherlands, for example, women who married non-Dutch men immediately lost their citizenship. So we can see how this is. So I hope this answers your question. There are a lot of contradictions. My sense is also that over the last years, particularly since the publication of my book, the idea of the Muslim women being, people who need to be saved, so the rescue narrative are much less prominent than they used to be when I was doing this work. And I think there are several reasons for this. I think the far right is very, very emboldened. It needs much less in a way to play out we are using a feminist repertoire for our politics. They are much, much bolder about anti-immigration, racism, etc. But we can talk about that. Simone, your question on mainstreaming of femonationalism, definitely. This is, in fact, one of the goals of the Horizon Project, to look very specifically at the ways, the tactics that they're using in order to mainstream their ideas, to normalize them increasingly and have them in a way become senso comune. I think this is crucial. One way we are thinking of doing that is to look at the specific ways in which they intervene in policy debates. So we are going to look at some key policy debates, obviously on gender in this specific case in each country, and look at the ways in which they intervene, they try to dictate and orient the agenda on those debates. I think this is already happening. There has been a mainstreaming of their ideas, very much in a way, I would say, enabled by the media, the mass media, unsurprisingly, many of them in the hands of, far-right supporters, particularly if you think of social media in particular. There is a big role of the social media here as well. There research increasingly looking at the way in which the algorithm is not just normalizing far-right ideas, but increasingly attracting young men into the manosphere and into certain spaces online that are dominated by the far right.
Thank you very much. Sara, are there any comments or questions, please? Right, should I just maybe ask myself a question? Meanwhile, we can see there is another question. So I'm thinking about, reflecting on the current nationalism, I see that all the populist right-wing nationalism, whether in the US, in Europe, Western world, has two enemies. First is the external one, and it can be broadly characterized as the illegal migrants. Whether it's Muslim, possibly yes, but it's basically these migrants and even more so illegal migrants. And the second one is the domestic one. And the domestic one is the left with its own woke culture. And I do understand, obviously, both femonationalism and homonationalism address the first enemy, so it's the external one, and more specifically, obviously, the Muslim men. But I wonder how much, and I'm sure maybe in your own present horizon research, this might come up, how much gender is also mobilized in instrumental way by the far right against not the external, but the internal one, right? So thinking about Giorgia Meloni, you mentioned before, when she goes in Spain, Vox, and she say, I'm a woman, I'm a mother, I'm Italian, I'm a Christian. Okay, let's forget for the time being the Christian, but I'm a woman. So she clearly borders what a woman means just to exclude the kind of woman that is much more blurred in his own boundaries that possibly is what the woke culture of the left might understand. So it's not possibly a question, it's just it's something to reflect on how much more possibly here there is to explore, that possibly intersect also femonationalism, homonationalism, but even go further. Yeah, so I just throw it there.
I mean, I think this is such a crucial point, Marco, and so thank you so much for raising it. I think you're absolutely right. I do think I am actually currently writing on this. I do think that gender feminism is the internal enemy for the far right, and I say in my work that in fact the far right has taken feminism, the achievements of the feminist movement over the last 30 years, much more seriously than the left very often. In a way, within the left, we still see discussions about gender being a secondary contradiction, not being in a way as central that class contradictions, that class politics, political economy, etc. This is a debate I often have with comrades and scholars. I consider myself I am a Marxist feminist. That's the tradition from which I work and from which I am inspired. And I think it is increasingly important to understand how the far right, in fact, has understood really well how feminism has become so central, not simply in the sense that it has achieved, absolute gender equality. I would never claim something like that. Obviously, that's not the point. But I think what the far right, in a way, understands, if you like, more at the level of gut politics, is precisely that feminism writ large, then we can talk about what this feminism is, has sedimented a certain senso comune, to use again the term that was used earlier. And in the sense that think about the ways in which a growing number of prominent artists have endorsed feminism. They have declared themselves to be feminist. Think about the ways in which all polls over the last 15 years show that increasingly the younger generations have, very open views about gender, homosexuality, transsexuality, women's rights, women's achievement, etc., etc. Now, I think one other thing that's important to foreground here, in my view, is that when we talk about the achievements of feminism, or if you like, the ways in which feminism and gender are the internal enemies for the far right, I think it's important to foreground the ways in which this feminism, particularly the feminism that puts forward gender as a spectrum, as fluid, etc. So I'm thinking of Judith Butler here, for example. It's a feminism that is also very much in dialogue, constantly in dialogue, but also constantly moving across other movements. I'm thinking about the anti-racist movements. Think of the increasing importance of intersectional feminism for this gender feminism. I'm thinking also about anti-imperialist movements. We see increasingly how a lot of feminist collectives move into the pro-Palestine demonstrations, for example, particularly in some countries, this becomes very clear. And so this is to say, they, in a way, I think they do address, you're very right, this is the internal enemy for them, and that is why they are mobilizing they are increasingly addressing gender as ideology, as something that they need to attack.
Thank you.
I guess, questions.
Thank you very much. We do have 2 more questions. I guess this will be the last 2, so we can take them together. And so, yes, Masha first.
Yeah, thank you for that. I mean, I was going to just chip in relation to this question of left-right feminisms and these other kinds of movements. Thinking about, for example, Judith Butler's talking about who's afraid of gender and so forth. I think actually one of the dangers here is saying feminism is one thing. And there have always been a myriad of feminisms, and the feminisms that are mobilized by these right-wing actors are principally very, very illiberal, liberal white feminisms. They only come from one particular part of the spectrum. They're not, by and large, intersectional, transnational, radical Black feminisms, etc. They are really quite particular. And those ones have often tried to have white women save brown women from brown men. I mean, they've always had those savior narratives built in. They've always been really quite reactionary rather than proactive in kind of a liberatory sense. And they've also not been very coalitional. So I think actually the kind of feminisms that are being mobilized by the right are not feminism as if it's all one thing, but are really quite a particular body of feminist thinking, and they're really not the rest of it. And the rest of it is still, and I totally agree with Marco's point that, and in that way, they're mobilizing this very slim brand against other feminisms and against other much more liberatory movements of a variety of things. And in that way, they are having a go at the left within the nation states. So I think there's an interesting thing here about diversity amongst feminisms, basically.
Thank you, Masha. Gilly, do you want to ask a question to Sara?
Yes, thank you. I'm sorry my camera's not working, but thank you so much for this fascinating talk. Yes, I think this question about the kind of left-right feminisms is so interesting. And in the UK context, I know there's a phenomenon that calls itself reactionary feminist, and they are trying to explicitly claim to be kind of beyond left and right, whilst actually arcing very much towards the right. But my question was about how you think this is kind of the seductions of femonationalism and how that plays out in terms of gender. So increasingly we hear this idea that young men are moving much more to the right, and young women are voting much more for like progressive left parties. But my sense is that that's too reductive, a kind of a binary way of thinking, and that actually this femonationalism does seem to be interpolating and has some seductive power, I guess, for women. So I just wonder what you think about how this is actually playing out in terms of who this is interpolating, who is being kind of drawn into this, I guess.
Thank you. Sara, the last 2, your comments, then we can end. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, no, I mean, first of all, really, again, thank you. These are crucial questions, crucial points. So to answer Marsha's first, I completely agree, Marsha. I couldn't agree more. And in the book, in fact, and all of my work, I try to be very careful about speaking of feminism in the plural, feminisms. So I couldn't agree more. In fact, I said some feminists, not just that would be identified closer to the right or conservative politics, but also some feminists who are traditionally closer to the left have nonetheless endorsed certain anti-Islam, in particular, politics. So this was, at least in the years of my research, a very complicated topic, because on the one hand, certainly even these different these feminists belonging to different traditions were converging, and I said some of them, I would not generalize, and I did not generalize in the book. They were converging, particularly around anti-Islam policies, very concrete policies, even though they completely disagreed on all other topics. So this is something that I try to interrogate in the book, and I have a whole chapter devoted to this, which tries also to understand, is particularly in dialogue with Nancy Fraser and her work on the in a way, complicity of what she calls a certain feminism, particularly over the last 20, 30 years with neoliberalism. You might remember a very important essay. Said that, I completely agree with you that, first of all, as I said, we need to talk about feminisms in the plural. I completely agree, and again, I address this in the book, about how some feminists have been historically, not only now, but also in the past, very complicit with racist politics. We know that the suffragettes, particularly the white liberal sections of the suffragettes movement, both in this country and in France, for example, were very much clear that they demanded the right of vote for them before it was accorded to men in the colonies. There was a whole debate about, they were saying, we did our deeds in the colonies, we supported you in your imperialist politics, but we want to be paid back by being enabled to become full citizens, and you cannot let this brown man vote before us. So this is to say, absolutely, there is a lot of racism that traverses these different feminist movements. In my work, where I'm also addressing the ways in which there are some specific, if you like, strands of feminism that have been particularly complicit, at least ideologically, with the far right. And here I'm thinking of neoliberal feminism. Katrin Rottenberg writes a lot about this, or carceral feminism. And here I'm thinking of the work of Elizabeth Bernstein. So certainly, I completely agree. These are very different from the emancipatory feminists that you named, the feminists of Angela Davis and the Combahee River collectives, much of intersectionality feminism, of course, Marxist and socialist feminists, and so on and so forth. Now, said that, and again, as I said, I think we very much agree on this, there is also something that puzzles me. And it is the fact that in spite of us knowing and very much understanding that there is historically a plurality of feminisms, and there has been a lot of conflict amongst these different traditions and approaches, particularly think from the 1960s, we have also witnessed a certain identification of feminism to core, let's say, so feminism in the singular, as a movement that's been increasingly represented and identified as an emancipatory movement, okay? So I think that's mainly the reason why a lot of feminists still want to maintain this label, this term, feminism. They call themselves feminist. And I think that we saw also a shift in the far right. I think that in the early 2000s, when they were saying, for example, we support the bombing of Afghanistan in order to, free women, Afghani women from the burqa, that was kind of, in a way, the beginning of this endorsement, this femonationalist repertoire in some ways. I think you could also see that this far right were not necessarily endorsing, certain specific feminist ideas. They were very much talking about a very general, if you like, even very wishy-washy idea of feminism. I think they have been much more specific in the type of feminisms that they would endorse more recently, which, as I said, is much more neoliberal and carceral feminism. But nonetheless, I think we also need to confront the fact that there is still this identification of feminism with emancipatory politics. And this is what the far right is reacting against. By this, I'm not saying that all of feminism is emancipatory. Of course, I'm not. But I'm saying, in my view, that this idea that feminism somehow can be identified as an emancipatory politics is very much the fruit, if you like, more of 1960s and 1970s feminism, which is when, for a brief period, the most emancipatory sections of these feminist movements were more hegemonical. They had, in fact, very much framed feminism much more in these terms, not without contradictions, of course. Sorry, I could speak. This is a topic I'm passionate about. I am constantly thinking about this. So I should probably stop now because otherwise this is going to be very long. But thank you very much, Marcia, because this is such an important point. On the question by Gilly, who are they trying to interpolate? I think I can be briefer on this. They are interpolating women as well. They clearly understand that there is a gender gap. There is a gap in electoral politics. This gap, interestingly, has been closed in France. Now in France, you have more or less the same number of women voting for far-right parties as men, but that's not the case in other countries. And I think one of the ways in which they are trying to interpolate more women to vote for them is increasingly by presenting themselves as the parties of women's safety, by presenting themselves as the ones who are concerned about young people, young women being victims of sexual assault, the streets, our streets not being safe, young women, but also young men being brainwashed by people who want to turn them into homosexuals or transgender people. So this, what I'm trying to say is they are really trying to use much more the idea of women's safety and moral panics in order to interpolate young women. And they are doing it increasingly by literally funding women's organizations. In 2025, in April 2025, there was a new organization in the UK formed. It's called the Women's Safety Initiative. If you look at the ex-Twitter posts or whatever they have written, it's very clear that it's very likely that Reform UK is behind them. And the whole campaign is about, we are concerned for women's safety, migrants have to leave the country, we don't want them anymore because they're a threat for women. Very recently, another organization has been formed, it's called the Pink Ladies. They present themselves again as, they are a little bit older women compared to the Women's Safety Organization, but again, the frame is the same. Schools need to be safe, our young women are in danger, our children are in danger, and again, the danger is represented by men. They have a massive social media presence. If you look at their profiles, you will see they're followed by thousands of people, and in a way, they are using the same social media repertoire of other far-right organizations, so very much targeting certain users of social media in certain spaces. So I think they do understand there is that gender gap and they want to fill it, they want to close it.
Sara, thank you very much. Yeah, I'm conscious of the time, so let me thank you again for this brilliant presentation and brilliant replies to all the questions. I hope the questions were also interesting for you, stimulating.
Very much.
And let me thank you also all the participants. This was the last talk for this seminar series. So LUNN will be back next year with a new, hopefully exciting seminar series as well, and maybe why not in the future, Sara, with a new project on the horizon. So thank you very much and have a great day. I'm gonna stop.